their capacity as occupational therapist, consultant, as well as Professor Zayd Waghid, who is Associate Professor and Chair at the South African Research Chairs Initiative, or SARChi, as it's known, at the Faculty of Education at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. Welcome to you both. Thank you for the time.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I don't know who would like to take this particular question, but I want to get an understanding as to why emotional intelligence became, or is becoming rather, such an important skill for educators today. Perhaps we can start with you, Nasreen.
Thank you very much, Mmatsheko. So when we look at emotional intelligence, it's an important skill for every single person. When growing up, we all come across knowing what IQ is all about, emotional quotient. And we're always taught of the impact of having a good IQ and how far it can take one in one's career. However, when we look at emotional intelligence, often what goes overlooked, as being overlooked, would be the fact that EQ is just as important, because if we have a good IQ but we aren't able to match that with adequate EQ, it can be quite problematic in terms of paving a way forward within one's career. So when we look at teachers, for example, teachers are placed in a position of power on a daily basis. Um, they are often the first exposure that a child has towards leadership. Apart from parents at home or parental figures, teachers have that ability to be able to really impact a child's life in terms of the emotional quotient. So when we look at self-esteem and self-concepts, so many of us can actually draw back on our experiences as kids when there were teachers who would actually really impact the way we felt about ourselves. And that's because teachers often have that first role to play whereby they're able to really impart that sense of EQ upon kids. And that is why it's so important for teachers themselves to present with adequate EQ, yet they are human as well. We find that teachers have so much pressure placed upon them, and they go through their own struggles, their own personal battles. They also have their own roles to fulfill at home as well as in the workplace itself. And they've got to bring all of that and still present themselves to the best of their ability within the classroom environment. And often you have a child that's maybe going through struggles, personal struggles, and they then have to be able to act as a counselor for a child. They've got to be able to help regulate children's emotions. They've got to be able to address communication gaps within the classroom, often being expected to read a room as well. And at the end of the day, we maintain that teachers are also human. And it's so important that we empower teachers with the necessary EQ skills that they require as well, as it's not necessarily a skill that's taught within training.
And we're going to get into, the role of training and what that looks like. But I want to get an understanding from you, Prof. What is it that has changed over the last 10 years, particularly from an emotional demands perspective on the teacher?
It's quite an important question. So teacher education curricula are designed according to what is known as the minimum requirements for teacher education qualification. And so universities are required to design their curricula according to the specific domain. So university curricula will focus on, as Nasreen mentioned, disciplinary knowledge. Young emerging aspirant teachers, they are required, of course, to develop the cognitive capacities. They are required to be subject experts in respective disciplines. They are, of course, also required to teach in specific ways. So there's a significant emphasis on the pedagogical approaches concerning how teachers should be adequately prepared for the classroom context. A significant challenge that I've seen over the last few years is that many young teachers who've entered the teaching fraternity, they struggle quite extensively concerning being able to um, address complex issues in schools, and of course there are systemic issues that ultimately impacts on teachers' well-being, and ultimately we're looking specifically at the social dynamics, which teacher education curricula don't always specifically focus on. There's a greater drive towards focus on focusing more about the disciplinary knowledge, the pedagogical knowledge. Students, of course, um, are trained according to learning about context and learning in context through teaching practice, but of course there are significant challenges that they are faced with when they have to deal with socio-economic issues in the classroom context, and of course how that impacts on teaching and learning. Um, some teachers, of course, new teachers, of course, are confronted with challenges around weak parental support, issues around heavy teaching workloads, and of course, this impacts again on the burnout of teachers. And so, what we're trying to push for is having not just only a once-off workshop with teachers, but also trying to have a more sustainable approach towards creating conditions for uh, teachers to be able to pragmatically address some of the major issues that they have in the classroom context.
Right. The issues are so many, but I'm trying to get an understanding of the space of emotional intelligence. I think that is a word that is often thrown around quite glibly, but do we actually understand what that is? From your perspective, Nasreen, as an OT, I mean, I'm sure you deal with these matters all the time because there's a big focus in South African classrooms on the logical mathematical intelligence, which people feel like that's what you need, to prepare yourself for the world. But there's linguistic intelligence, there's spatial intelligence, and so many others. Let's talk about emotional intelligence particularly. What exactly is it? And is it something that can be taught, or does it develop as a consequence of other forms of intelligence, if you will?
So when we look at emotional intelligence, it's something that actually starts from the very beginning, from the day that you are born. And that's really one's first exposure already. So, we look at aspects such as upbringing. Um, Prof mentioned parental support as well within students, and that's something which is very important because parents are that primary source of teaching emotional intelligence from the beginning. But as the human being actually progresses through life, and as they actually start their first steps, and then they move on to preschool and they move into the teaching environment, that's really where their EQ is actually where they actually find their foundation and where it starts to become cemented, and they start to actually be able to look at themselves through the eyes of others, and they also are able to then formulate opinions about themselves, how they interact with others, and they are also aware of how others might interact with them. So when we look at EQ, we look at aspects such as self-awareness,
Mm-hmm.
and when we look at how are we aware of how we present ourselves towards others. So often we find that teachers might find that there's a child that they're battling to get along with, and it's always important then to be able to have self-awareness, to actually draw back to oneself and say, how am I actually interacting with this learner? Am I coming across as intimidating, or am I actually approachable?
Mm-hmm.
We look at aspects such as empathy. Empathy is something which is something everybody ought to have, but yet it doesn't always come naturally to everyone. And often in the classroom environment, we find that as much as teachers would perhaps think that they are presenting with empathy, maybe it translates differently to a learner. And it's so important to be able to bring that forth when actually interacting with a child or with a student or a learner, to be able to let them feel that they are being presented with empathy. And then we look at aspects such as motivation, and it's motivation both within the teacher feeling motivated to be able to come forward and show up as their best, but also to be able to invoke that sense of motivation within a child as well. So those are the aspects that we really look at, and it's so important to be able to have communication skills as well. When we look at teacher communication skills, and Prof mentioned teacher burnout, which is so important, and often we find that communication is something which becomes a huge difficulty, a huge challenge in the classroom environment. And it's actually
Mm-hmm.
a two-way street because a teacher has to then be able to communicate with so many learners at the same time, and each and every one of them have different personalities, and also be able to really read a child and be able to know when something is amiss or when something is wrong because of the incredible pressure that's being placed on teachers.
Right. All right. I'd like us to actually unpack, what's to come in a workshop as hosted by the Western Cape Education Department and the Cape Peninsula University of Tech. And we're going to talk about, educating, meeting, life orientation, such an important workshop in conversation with Nasreen Cariem, an occupational therapy consultant, as well as Prof. Zayd Waghid, Associate Professor and Chair at the South African Research Chairs Initiative. Let's take a break.
This is the generation that learned to turn limitation into expression, into opportunity, and the freedom to create. Turning data bundles into business, cell phones into classrooms, bedrooms into studios. All over the continent, young Africans are creating magic in their language. Dreaming it, living it, streaming it. For the whole entire world to see and feel. Celebrating the youth of the continent. Youth Month on Channel Africa, the African perspective. The Journal with Mosito. Catch it on the Channel Africa app, SABC Plus, and on channelafrica.co.za. Weekdays from 9 till 12 p.m. Central African Time.
23 minutes into 11 a.m. in Central African Time. We continue our conversation with Nasreen as well as Prof. Waghid on the line, looking at emotional intelligence and how that filters into the classroom. Where is the teacher in this conversation and where is the pupil? And how can the two worlds meet to really, come through in modern classrooms in ways that are progressive at this time. Prof, let's talk about this critical workshop that's going to be happening. As I'd mentioned, it is hosted by the Western Cape Education Department, collaborating with the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. Talk to us about who this particular workshop is designed for.
So the rationale behind the design of the workshop stems from the fact that universities that often function in isolation in terms of the designing of curricula for teachers. So teacher education institutions prepare student teachers for schools according to as I mentioned, the Mr. Tech policy. And then we have, of course, teachers being required to teach according to the CAPS curriculum. And so one of the fundamental aspects that we would, of course, want to address is the imbalance between how universities function in relation to schools in order to develop what is known as a community of practice. Now, there has been research that has shown that when teacher education institutions work more closely with teachers in the redesigning of curricula, teachers are more adequately prepared in order to address some of the major issues that they face in the classroom context around discipline, um, and of course many other issues. And so the purpose of the workshop is to address this imbalance, specifically concerning our universities and schools towards cultivating a community of practice, um, where teachers are not seen in isolation from other teachers, but they are seen part of this practice towards in a cohesive manner addressing the issues that they encounter, being able to share knowledge, being able to share their own experiences, their own challenges as a means of um, coming up with more pragmatic and practical ways towards addressing issues that affect all teachers in society. And so the purpose of the workshop is to create that community of practice and to create this community of inquiry so that we transcend beyond just focusing extensively on um, developing the cognitive capacities of teachers and ultimately on learners, but also, of course, to first develop the social dynamics concerning how teachers function, and then eventually seeing even students as teachers as part of the process concerning learning and teaching, where we disrupt even the power dynamics concerning how teachers see themselves in a classroom context. And so we want to look at moving towards this particular process.
Okay. Nasreen, from your perspective, I mean, just looking at the layout of this particular workshop, what practical strategies can be implemented out of workshops of this nature back into the classroom to benefit the teacher and the pupil, especially when trying to navigate difficult emotional, situations that can happen in the classroom environment?
I think it's a very good question because, especially the times that we find ourselves in at the moment, we find that teen suicide is something which is alarmingly on the rise, and often we find that children are facing anxiety and depression, and it often goes unnoticed, not because of any lack of effort on teachers, but more because of the fact that children have ways of masking it. And I think it's very important we at this moment in time, EQ is very, very important for many reasons. And as Prof said, to be able to in turn bring out that within children as well, we really want to be able to give teachers that opportunity to find ways to be able to read students in a sense of sometimes kids will, just as teachers come and have to present themselves as best as they can, often we find that learners do the same, and they present with lots of shame around anxiety and depression, and they will also put their best foot forward. So we want to be able to equip teachers with that skill whereby they find that the psychosocial skills have improved and they're able to empower kids in turn with improved psychosocial skills to be able to feel free to approach teachers with anything and to be able to build that sense of emotional safety within a classroom environment. So we really want to be able to give that to teachers, to be able to have them adapt that sense of how do I, as a teacher, provide an environment whereby I'm able to allow all of these kids to feel emotionally safe and secure? And how am I able to prevent myself from being unapproachable, but rather to be as approachable as possible and create safe boundaries and safe havens for kids to come forward with whatever problems they might be suffering from, whether it is an issue such as psychosocial or anxiety and depression, or if learners are struggling. We find that kids
Okay.
are presenting with depression due to the fact that they are struggling at school. So we want to be able to give teachers those skills and those tools to be able to identify that as well.
Okay, thank you very much for your input, both of you. But Professor, before I cut the call with the both of you, I just need to get a sense of how we can send our teachers to attend this meeting. It's very important. Where do we send RSVPs, etc.?
So there will be communication from the education department,
Okay.
and our colleague at the WCD will then send out invitations to schools to invite teachers to be part of the program.
Okay. Thank you very much to the both of you, Nasreen Cariem, as well as Professor Zayd Waghid, joining me on the line. And as we wrap up the conversation, we're really talking about a very important life orientation, emotional intelligence, EQ, that's going to be taking place on Tuesday, the 30th of June, 2026. And I would encourage you to just keep a lookout for that. Take a look at your inbox and see what's coming in, and make sure that your teachers from your particular particular institution are part of this conversation. Very important. 11:31, Fikile Lungwadi, standing by with the latest sports.
Sports on Channel Africa. The African perspective.